I am Chris Barr. I also go by my pen name, NotADoc. Some people think that's because I'm anti-doctor. It's not because I'm anti-doctor. I'm just trying to bring balance to the force. We have a proclivity where people go to the doctor at the drop of a hat. So we need to learn how to be intelligent with our choices. So that's why I call myself NotADoc, not because I'm the anti-doc. Nutritional historian, science and health historian, researcher. I'm going to talk about nutrition and history, a little bit about medicine and history. There's a nutrient, I'm going to see a show of hands. Is there anybody here who has never heard of vitamin C? Okay, I figured that would probably be the case. Everybody knows that one. Okay, that's the only substance that's referred to in nutrition that there's ever been a Nobel Prize given for. It was in 1937. Dr. Albert Szent-Györgyi received a Nobel Prize for his discovery of or establishing of this substance called now vitamin C as a nutrient. In case you don't know, you can read the acceptance speech of every person who has ever received any Nobel Prize. Go to the Nobel website, they're all listed there. Well, if you look at Szent-Györgyi's speech, it's like 10 pages long. At the near the very end, one of the last paragraphs, he said this: "At the time that I had just detected the rich vitamin content of the paprika, I was asked by a colleague of mine for pure vitamin C. This colleague himself suffered from a serious hemorrhagic diathesis. Since I still did not have enough of this crystalline substance at my disposal then, I sent him paprikas. My colleague was cured. But later, we tried in vain to obtain the same therapeutic effect with pure vitamin C." Okay, for those who don't know what hemorrhagic diathesis is, okay, that's breaking down the blood vessels and bleeding internally under the skin. It's a central part of scurvy. Okay, you can't have scurvy without having hemorrhagic diathesis. The vitamin they call C is allegedly the preventative agent and the cure for scurvy. At the end of the speech, the man who received the Nobel Prize for discovering this substance told them it doesn't work. And that's been lost now for almost 80 years. When Dr. Hobbs asked me to speak to this class, I immediately went to Dr. Szent-Györgyi in this work because Szent-Györgyi knew that isolated chemical purified substances aren't the same as what's in food. He even told them when they gave him the prize for this discovery, it doesn't work. Now he didn't come out like I just said it and said, "Hey, you guys just gave me a prize for something that doesn't work." Okay, but it's in there, and people don't even know. Okay, Szent-Györgyi, though, was part of the establishment. He was a Hungarian, and he was sponsored here by the Rockefeller family and Columbia University. And he got here from poor upbringing through supporters, people funding him. So he just decided not to say much of anything, except, like Dr. Hobbs, in his classes, in his lectures. He would tell students these things. It didn't really make much or any difference with hardly anybody. But he had one student named Andy Zalay, who was a Hungarian. Maybe he took to Szent-Györgyi or paid more attention because he was a fellow Hungarian, he was a Nobel Prize winner. I don't know all the whys and wherefores, but Andy Zalay, hearing Szent-Györgyi talk about the different state of these substances, it stuck with him. Now, he didn't start out that way, though. Andy Zalay went into American commerce and worked his way up to become a top leading force in pharmaceutical, and he was a registered pharmacist. And he made millions, and when he retired, he always remembered what Szent-Györgyi said. So he decided to try and do something about it. So Zalay figured out how to grow nutrients. By the way, he wasn't the first one. There have been a few other people who've done it before and since. Zolai's was more novel and more effective than the ones before him. There's only one I know since then that's more effective. But it was because of that, Szent-Györgyi, he would tell his students these things, and of course they just want to get past class and get on to get their degree and become a doctor or optometrist or whatever the goal is. So it really didn't stick with him, but it did with Andy Zolai. So Szent-Györgyi knew that what's today called vitamin C really isn't what they say that it is. And sadly, that's the case with pretty much every nutrient that there is. When Szent-Györgyi was finally used up and retired and they weren't paying him any more money, he finally wrote a book in the 70s when he was in his 80s called The Living State. I highly recommend it. Most people won't read it because they don't want to spend $150 for the book. Although I have found it lately for $50 to $70, people probably still don't want to spend that either. It's one of my treasures because he finally wrote what he had told his students for years about. And he wrote it down, The Living State. And my favorite Szent-Györgyi quote was in the beginning of this book. He wrote, "My scientific career was a descent from higher to lower dimensions, led by a desire to understand life. I went from animals to cells, from cells to bacteria, from bacteria to molecules, and molecules to electrons. The story has its irony, for molecules and electrons have no life at all. On my way, life ran out between my fingers." It took him almost 40 years after getting the Nobel Prize, almost 50 years, to finally publicly make it, well, sort of publicly. He wrote it in a book. It's an academic textbook, so hardly anybody still has read it. I found it not long after it was written, and it was part of my founding and my research. So Szent-Györgyi knew there was a difference, and I came to think of this, to open this way, because as Dr. Hobbs here has students, that's who Dr. Szent-Györgyi, Nobel Prize winner, the only Nobel Prize ever given for anything nutritional. He spoke to his students, and one of them, almost 30 years later, did something with it that's changed lives today, and it's part of what I've been doing since the 70s. So I'm hopeful that more than one person here won't wait until you've made your millions and retires, but will take something from here of what I present. Because what I present to you is truth that is profound and very little known. I love to talk to doctors and professionals when they'll talk to me about nutrition, about the difference, especially as it relates to, I understand this is an introduction to pharmacology. On the subject of vitamin C, I actually discovered more than 30 years ago that it isn't the anti-scorbutic substance. Okay, now you won't read that anywhere else, that's just from me, but I have all the proof on it. And I sat with a leading biochemist, well published, more than 100 published papers. I spent more than 2 hours going over with him why the substance called vitamin C is not the anti-scorbutic factor. And when I got done, he told me, "Chris, I can't refute a single thing you've said, but it can't be true because it goes against so much of what we've been taught." I laughed in his face. I said, "Mark, you've been taught wrong." And he just shrugged his shoulders. And that's what I've been doing now for more than 30 years ever since, and teaching the truth to people who will hear it. It's not very many, because it goes against so much of what we're taught. So I love to talk to professionals, especially since usually anybody that's a pharmacologist, a pharmacist, a doctor, pretty much anybody in the establishment is going to tell you what they've been taught by rote. Well, there's no difference between food and synthetic. There's no difference. One's the same as the other. And I love it when they tell me that, because I always agree with them, and then they get really nervous, because the way I agree with them, I said, "You're absolutely correct, chemically." I put that little hitch in there on purpose. We are not just chemical beings. We're not just biological beings. We're also physical beings. We're biochemical, we're biophysical, we're multifaceted. We're not just chemical. Well, if you take any of these, what they call nutrients, and that includes minerals, vitamins, amino acids, whatever they are, chemically, actually they're rarely ever identical, but they're pretty much the same chemically. But physically, they're different. And that's what I tell these professionals when I tell them, chemically, they're the same. But physically, they're different. And that usually brings kind of a groan, because how many people here, has anybody here taken physics yet? Okay, how many people love physics? Okay, one late. Right. So several hands went up, they took physics. Hardly anybody likes physics. It's complicated, it's kind of a pain. So when I tell them, but physically they're different, they kind of go, they don't want to go there. Well, I have here, if you want to look at it later, I don't have a big giant handout, but this is 100,000 magnification of 3 different nutrients, and there are more than this. This is just for one example. Of the USP, that's the chemical synthesized, made by man form of this nutrient. I've got vitamin C, vitamin B1, which is thiamine, and zinc. So 2 vitamins and a mineral here. Okay, this is 100,000 magnification with an electron microscope. Well, if you look at the chemical form versus the food form, okay, they're the same substance, allegedly. Chemically they are, but physically they don't look anything at all the same. I also have color chromatography of the same substances, and I don't know if I can find my nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. Okay, they don't look anything at all the same. That's because they're not the same. And they work differently in the body. In fact, the electron microscope to me is the best one to look at, because you can just see, when you look at the form that man makes, it's large, misshapen, oddly rectangular boulders. And when you look at the way that same substance is identified in food, it's very small, smooth, cylindrical balls. Now, what do you suppose gets into your cell structure easier and with less damage? Small, smooth, spherical balls, or large, craggy, misshapen boulders? Okay. Well, when you actually do the bioavailability analyses that have been done by many for decades, usually ignored, passed over. But when you look at them, the way a nutrient occurs in food is always superior in the way the body uses it to the chemical extract. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that. It's not just one. But one of the most important is because it's not the same thing. It's similar, but it's not the same. There are also cofactors that when you isolate the substance, the cofactors aren't there. And there are thousands of items that have been identified in food. There are many more that haven't been identified. Most of those, we don't know what they do. But in food they exist, and when you isolate the substance, you've now taken it away from all the, who knows what's good that they're supposed to do, and they don't do because you don't have it anymore. And when you chemically isolate it and make it, it's a different form. I use an example of a key in a lock. A key is cut a certain way to a particular lock. And if you insert that key into the lock, then it works and it opens it up. But if the key is cut a little bit oddly, some of you may have had keys made and had to go back and say, hey, it doesn't work. Because if it's just a little bit off, it won't work at all. Or maybe it'll kind of catch in the lock and it kind of works for a while. But eventually, either it's going to break off either the key or in the tumbler, and it won't work anymore. Well, that's what you do when you artificially make something for the cellular locking mechanism, and you have keys that aren't quite cut right. They kind of work, sort of, like St. George said in his Nobel Prize speech. We found in paprika, lemons, etc., that this substance prevented scurvy and eliminated it. But you can go back in the journals. This is what I have in my archives, in my personal library. You can find all kinds of studies after that that were submitted and said, we don't understand, in pediatric studies in the 40s, in the 30s, throughout the world, different people that were using vitamin C and said, it sometimes works to treat scurvy and sometimes it doesn't have any effect at all. Well, because it's not actually the problem. It's another aspect. But that's never been addressed for all these years. I addressed it more than 30 years ago, and I've addressed it from time to time, but people don't want to hear it because it's a big industry. And there's a lot of money involved. So people are happy to get some results, and so they don't really know what the truth is. So that's what I have done. And if you go back to the history of vitamins, okay, I have here, I brought with me, this is the very first book ever. It's from 1919. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? Anybody notice anything? Can you read that from the back row? Anybody see what that says on the top line?
Vitamins.
It's vitamins. But he misspelled it. He's got an E in there. What's that E doing there? Well, the very foundation of nutrition is based in error. This is Dr. Casimir Funk, PhD. This is the legendary book that they don't really want you to know about it because it's kind of an embarrassment. Because this is the basis of nutrition in the world today. Is Dr. Casimir Funk at Vanderbilt University, had a lot of backing from rich people, who wrote this book, A Short Treatise on the Discovery, Nature, and Other Characteristics of These Vital Elements of Nutrition. Because the first one that they discovered, or actually the first one that they isolated, the second one they discovered, they weren't able to isolate when they found, okay, this one we can't quite isolate it. The first one that was isolated was thiamine, which is vitamin B1, which is an amine, which you have to have for muscle function and some other functions also. And if you don't, then you die. You can't live without it. So Casimir Funk went, aha! These are vital amines. Of course, an amine just means it has nitrogen attached to it. It's like amino acids. So these are vital amines that you have to live. So they coined this word, vitamine, with an E at the end. Well, the next one they found wasn't an amine. And the one after that wasn't either. And in fact, there's only a few of these substances that are actually amines. So rather than say, oops, we goofed, let's call it something else, they just silently drop the E off. These are vital mineral compounds, because everything's made out of minerals. This table's made out of minerals. You're made out of minerals. This chalkboard made. So these are vital mineral compounds. So the whole basis of nutrition has been based on error from the beginning. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that it's full of errors still. And it's monetarily driven. Szent-Györgyi had actually discovered hexuronic acid. That's the correct name for what they call vitamin C, because it's a six-sided uronic acid, so it came up with the name hexuronic acid. In the 20s, and he set it aside because he was studying oxygen reductase factors, and it's just a mild oxygen reductase. So he put it away. But then a large pharmaceutical company in America said, hey, we have figured out a process that we can make that really inexpensively. And if you actually look at the study that Szent-Györgyi received his Nobel Prize for, it's actually a fraudulent study. But it was done for commercial reasons. And if you look at the history of Nobel Prizes, they're primarily economically driven and not particularly scientifically driven. It's to benefit somebody's business somewhere. So they knew how much of this substance, hexuronic acid, was in the amount of lemon juice or lime that would prevent scurvy or that would reverse it. So they took lab animals and they gave them half the amount of lemon juice that they knew they needed to get rid of scurvy or to prevent it. And guess what? They didn't prevent scurvy and they didn't reverse it. Well, they only used half the amount they knew they needed. But they took this new chemical that was created artificially by using white sugar and treating it with nail polish remover, otherwise known as acetone, sodium hydroxide, you might know that as lye, and sulfuric acid. And they manipulated the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen structure of white refined bleached sugar that's had all the nutrition removed from it, and then manipulated it to make it mimic the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen structure of hexuronic acid. And it was really cheap, and it still is. And to this day, more than 95% of all the vitamin C in the marketplace that you buy uses that same method. So they used twice as much of that substance as they knew the amount of hexuronic acid from food was required. And that's how this study was published. Well, the foremost scholar of the day, a man named Zilva from Oxford on scurvy, when he saw the study, he said, it's an interesting study, but it doesn't prove the point. Well, they heckled him out of the scientific community. Other scientists came up who were backed by the same pharmaceutical company and said, oh, this is just a jealous old man. He's just jealous because he didn't make this discovery. So they glossed over the fact that, well, you use twice as much of a substance in an artificial form to get a result, and you compared it to half the amount you knew would work and it didn't work, and you said, oh, this proves it. Well, it's a rigged study. But ever since then, a lot of money's been made from that, and still being made from that, for a substance that's a whole nother 2-hour lecture as to why that isn't the reason scurvy occurs, and why that it sometimes will prevent it and sometimes it'll get rid of it, but not always, because it's not actually the problem. So this is what I've been doing since the 70s now, is looking at how are these bodies intended to function? How have we gotten away from that? How do we get back to that? And this is the essence of why these things have happened. We don't really know nutrition because it's based on fraudulent, really, research, bad science, or half-truths. And remember, a half a truth is a whole lie. Okay? So even the very word is wrong. This substance, no, it's not. Vitamins and minerals are not the same from one form to another. There's a difference. And your body knows the difference between that which is created in food versus that which man makes because he thinks he's so smart. In Scripture it talks about the wisdom of man that is foolishness to the Creator. Because we think we're so smart, but again, when I talk to professionals, they get quiet real quick. I said, yeah, chemically they're the same, but physically they're different. And again, to emphasize, your body, there is a difference, and your body knows the difference. Okay? So you can only get so far using copycats as compared to what the body really needs. So what a doctor says, as they often do as they're trained, well, you should get your nutrients from food. Well, that's actually true, but not for the reasons that he thinks. Because if a nutrient isn't grown, it's really not a nutrient. It's just another drug. All these things that pass in Walmart or the pharmacy or the health food store, the vast majority of them, more than 95%, I call them drugs light. The nutrition industry gets really mad at me. Oh, they are not. Well, yes, they are. They're artificial creations. They're drugs. They don't have as severe side effects. They do have side effects. So they're drugs light. But if you want real results, use real nutrition. And that's what I have seen. Back in 1959, the last that I know of all the nutrients identified as essential was the mineral chromium at the National Institutes of Health by Dr. Klaus Schwartz. Now, 2 years prior to that, he had established the essentiality of the mineral selenium, which, if you go back to 1911, the oldest substance that's been shown to be effective against cancer in medical journals is the mineral selenium. It goes back to 1911. And there were numerous studies in medical journals in the 19-teens, the 1920s, and 1930s that kept leading growing information to this mineral could treat selenium. Now, today, selenium is known as a preventative, but hardly anybody knows that it actually was used as a curative item. And they used crude forms. They didn't use food forms. So they didn't have perfect results, but they had better results than other things that were being tested in the 19-teens through 1940. But in 1940, there was a study done with a form of selenium that is the only, still to this day, tagged or identified as a toxic substance, selenium disulfide. And they did a study that said the effects of a selenium dietary Well, they fed these lab animals and they put a pesticide that they added into the food that had selenium disulfide in it. And it didn't go well. So they said, oh, this substance could be harmful, could kill people, it could cause cancer. Now there was no cancer in that study in any of the lab animals, but that was the conclusion. So it kind of disappeared for 20 years until Dr. Klaus Schwartz at the National Institutes of Health found out that without selenium, your liver fails. If your liver fails, you're dead. So selenium was established as essential. In 1959, continuing in those liver studies, they found out that chromium was essential for sugar metabolism. Very little has been done with that information since then, even though the assistant to Dr. Schwartz in 1959, Dr. Walter Hirsch, reportedly proclaimed, we've found the cause of diabetes. It's this molecule, glucose tolerance factor, which is a chromium-containing molecule. And it's pretty much not gone anywhere since then. Predominantly, I've utilized it that way and had people reverse their diabetes since the 1979 by using the right form and the right amount. But if you don't use the right form, it doesn't work. In some cases, the food form makes a bigger difference than in others. In no case is the difference greater than with chromium. The absorption rate of chromium chloride, which was the only form they had to supplement in 1959 and for about 20 years thereafter, has an absorption rate of less than 1/2%. Okay, less than 1/2%. That's right next to nothing. Okay, so when they were excited about the initial results, and then another Dr. Henry Alfred Schroeder was studying the toxicological basis of chromium and fed lab animals diets with elevated chromium levels, because he wanted to find the toxic effects. Well, he ended up setting a longevity record. See, he wasn't a nutritionist, he was a toxicologist. But he began to study nutrition after that, because he started with 3 elements in his toxicology studies. Cadmium, which today is, everyone knows that's a heavy metal, it's bad for you, it causes all kinds of problems. Lead, everybody knows lead's bad for you. And chromium. Well, he documented bad effects from cadmium and from lead, but he set a longevity record with chromium. And they then found out that chromium chloride wouldn't work in humans. The body didn't receive it. So after more than 10 years of trying, they started working with culturing growing. This is before Zalé at Georgie Stew. And if you get a hold of Dr. Schroeder's book, The Trace Elements in Man from 1975, in there he writes his most excited amounts, a lot of getting around he covers there, but he talks most excitedly about chromium and how excited he was that Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Mertz were very close to perfecting this growing form of growing it in a food medium. And that's where I came along, was shortly after that. Well, it still hasn't really taken off after, going on 40 years now. But I've seen the results and transferred that then with selenium and with every other nutrient. So I've been working with nutrients in a way that I don't know anybody else who's done this. I know some people who've worked some with whole foods, not very many. I don't know anyone who's taken the stance that I have. If it doesn't come from food, I don't use it, period. Because, again, I maintain, and I believe I can make the point scholastically, if it isn't grown, it's not a nutrient. Okay? And so I've seen almost routinely what others call miracles. I wrote more than 10 years ago a book about chromium, sparkling health for your life and living. Kind of making a pun off it. Chromium is shiny, sparkling health for your life and living. It's actually the most important nutrient discovered to date, though very few know very much about it. And most of what the few know is wrong. When you actually see what chromium does, it's not just a sugar item, although that's the only thing it's recognized as essential for. But from before you are born until the day you die, you need chromium more than you need anything else. The primary reason for birth defects is a lack of chromium. That's a long discussion we don't have time for. The first element to pass the placental barrier en masse is chromium. That's why ladies, when you get pregnant, often the first sign a woman has that she's pregnant, if she's not paying real close attention to her cycle, is, oh, I'm feeling tired. Well, pregnancy doesn't cause tiredness. Chromium is central to the energy cycle. You know, Krebs cycle, oxygen, or glucose and oxygen, you can't get glucose into the cell without chromium efficiently. Okay, so if you're low on chromium and you get pregnant, and one of the first elements to pass the placental barrier in mass is chromium, all of a sudden your low levels become next to nothing and you're tired. Okay, well, the pregnant women with which I have worked since the 1970s, without exception, in every case, when they've had a previous pregnancy to compare it to, have always told me, this is the best pregnancy I've ever had. They never get tired, because I have them on the right form of chromium, and the right amount is determined by human studies conducted by the US government in the 1960s. So I know how much they need, I know the form to use. But the number one selling form of chromium in the marketplace is actually a slow poison, chromium perchlorate. The food form isn't even recognized. If you look up government's subject, by the way, the US government has websites on nutrition. And sometimes they even have good information on them. They don't even acknowledge the food form of chromium. They'll mention chromium perchlorate, chromium chloride, chromium polynicotinate, but they don't even mention that there's another form and that's the only one that actually works. And it's the same, they do the same thing for selenium. They don't mention the only form that actually works. So when you use the forms that work, then they work. What a surprise, what a concept. And that's food. It has to be, we still don't understand photosynthesis. Yeah, I mean, we can describe what happened in plant, these things occur, but we can't duplicate it. Okay, well, through the process of coming through the root structure, going through photosynthesis, there's a change made. Okay, plants take rocks and convert them into a form that we can use. I sometimes like to have fun with people and tell them, everyone's a vegetarian. It's just a matter of whether you're a primary vegetarian or a second-hand vegetarian. Because, and by the way, I'm not a vegetarian, so I'm not trying to prop up vegetarianism. It's usually not a good idea unless you really know what you're doing. But if you say, well, I don't eat vegetables, I just eat meat. Well, guess where every meat that you eat got its nutrition from eating plants. Okay? You're getting secondary nutrition as far as the photosynthesis goes, as far as the form of the nutrient. Okay? Plants can take rocks and change them into a form we can use. If you swallow rocks, you'll just have a rough stomach and you probably might tear up some of the stomach tissues and the intestinal tract. It's not a good idea. Except that's what people eat, and that's what's added to the food supply in very small amounts in the form of enhancement or fortification. They remove the actual food form and then they put back a small amount of the same that is substance. Actually, only some of them, not all of them. Okay, so if you don't have the right form, it doesn't work. Okay, and that's again what I discovered. I didn't realize I discovered it. I was just doing research and thought I came across it. It just made sense to me. I wasn't trying to start a revolution. It just made sense. Well, nutrients should be from food. I now have the science for why that's true, not just an idea. So I wrote the book on chromium and have helped, I don't even know how many people with pregnancy, diabetes issues, and there are many others. Well, selenium is a key to cancer. Back in 1996, JAMA actually had a study published that made headlines across America. But it was on Christmas Day. How many of you, first thing you do when you wake up on Christmas morning, go and grab the newspaper and read the news? Anybody here does that? Okay. Well, it was cover story on Christmas Day in '96. Selenium may prevent cancer. I was shocked. Well, I wasn't shocked that it might. I knew that. I was shocked it got published. That was in the newspaper. But I was surprised because it said, the person who did the study said we were surprised at the results, and I recognized his name as someone who had written a paper 20 years before, published in the Journal of Nutrition Reviews, that said, can selenium modify cancer risk? And he was one of 7 co-authors that said yes. And then when they did this 12-year study, they found out it did, and he was surprised. It didn't make sense. Well, that's a long story, won't get into what happened there, other than they did find they had a total reduction of cancer incidence in people who had previously had cancer of 50% of every type of cancer. Prostate cancer was a 63% reduction, colon cancer 57%. So there is no substance before then or since that has ever come anywhere near 50% reduction of cancer incidence. Okay. But how many people here have heard about, hey, you take selenium to prevent cancer in the last 20 years since that study's been published? Nothing's come close to it. And there are reasons for it, and we don't even have time to even discuss the highlights of why that is, but I didn't talk about it much, except to people really close to me, until about 20 years ago, when I was helping so many people with so many different things. And somebody said, don't you know something about cancer? Yeah, so I told them, and well, since then I've written my book, Selenium One Cancer Answer, 100 Years and Counting. The form of the nutrient is key, the amount is key, and it's all based on science. It's available, but ignored. So a year ago, a little more than a year ago, a man down in Conway was diagnosed with an aggressive lung cancer that had already metastasized. It was already stage 4 when they discovered it. The doctors gave him no hope. They told him and his wife he had 6 to 12 months to live. They told his wife privately he won't be home for Christmas. So in other words, when they said 6 to 12 months, they were just kind of didn't want to deflate him too quickly, because the wife, they told privately, it won't be a year. Well, long story short, after following the protocol of nutrients in the right form, centered on selenium and chromium and silicon and some liver support, within 6 months, he was cancer-free. The cancer that had metastasized to his liver was all across his lymph, in his upper torso, in his brain, filling the right lung with small tumors, and a grapefruit-sized tumor in the left lung. Within 6 months, was gone. And he's now living a very active life and driving all over, and it's getting me a lot more attention from people calling up, hey, how can I do that? You know, I tell people, well, here's the science, and here's what you can do according to science, you know. That's the latest big result, but I've had lots of things similar to that through almost 40 years now. By using nutrition. In fact, I coined a new word 35 years ago, nutrition. I spell it N-E-W, nutrition. Because what passes for nutrition since 1919 is largely flawed. We have to go back and unlearn the errors and relearn. So that's what I've been trying to do since the 70s, is get people to understand nutrition. And for people that are in medicine or in healing arts, to add it to what they're doing, to utilize these things. I did bring a handout for anyone that's, in fact, why don't you take one of these and just pass them down. There are 17 names at the top. The first name, Antoine Béchamp, is the key to understanding real science. It's a contemporary of Pasteur, and there's some quotes about him and his work there. There are 17 men listed there. This is the foundation of my work, is these men. All but 3 of them are doctors. Most of those are medical doctors. And you won't find hardly any of it on Google, so don't try. I mean, you can try, you'll find a little bit. The information I've gotten is from the medical journals, from the university libraries, because in case you don't know this, there is more information not on the internet than there is on the internet. And a good portion of what is on the internet isn't accurate. So real research is done either in a laboratory or by going and reading the work of people that were in the laboratory. I haven't gone to laboratories myself. I've just cherry-picked. I've gone to the people who've done the work. Dr. John Ellis on there actually wrote me a note before he died, and he said, thank you so much for the great research you're doing. And I called him, I laughed, I said, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. He was a tall man, so that was a pun. He's a giant of science, and he was a tall man. I said, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, my research, I'm just collating data and putting it together. The last Zen György quote that I'll close with is kind of the summation of my life. Zet Georgi said, discovery consists in seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. So I'd like to encourage you to keep your minds open. Sometimes you have to say certain things to pass a test, but don't wait like Andy Zalay did 30 years until he made his fortune and then start making a difference. And he's still not well known either. And last I knew he was still alive in his 90s. So we need to find out, and do these things work? I got this a month ago from a local woman who's been doing what I say for 20 years now. She's 60-ish, pushing 60, 5'3", 195 pounds. You know, she's told she's obese. But she works at one of the big corporations around here that does an annual health fair. And for the last 5 years they started doing this, and when they counsel each person, you wait in line, they tell them, go to your doctor and ask them for statin drugs and tell them you need this and that. When she walked up there the first time, and every year since then, but the first time they went, well, you're obese. Okay, really? I needed numbers to tell me I'm 5'3", 100, you need, okay. Because her cholesterol is perfect. Her HDL, the good cholesterol, is higher than doctors ever see. Her LDL is very low, perfect. Her triglycerides are perfect. Her cholesterol HDL ratio is perfect, better than perfect actually. All of her numbers are perfect. The first time she showed this to me 5 years ago, I laughed. I said, you don't understand. Doctors rarely see any one of these numbers in a patient. I guarantee you, they never see all of these in one patient. She's a local girl from around here, raised on biscuits and gravy, but 20 years ago she started making biscuits and gravy with whole grains and spelt instead of white flour. She began using wholesome ingredients. So she still eats the same diet, but she changed the way and she started taking these forms. This is what Andy Zalay created. This is another company. She started taking these key nutrients in the amounts that I had discovered almost 40 years ago. And she's been doing this for 20 years now. So even though she's worked 40 hours a week in a factory with overtime often and driven an hour one way for 40 years, she should be falling apart according to all the rules. But she's in robust health. I mean, she's big, but she likes to eat. But she eats good food. Obesity doesn't cause problems. When the weight is not supported by nutrition to support it, that's why there's a problem. If you have the nutrients to support the girth, then the girth isn't an issue. Most people are overweight from eating at McDonald's and Kraft macaroni and cheese, and they're eating refined foods that have no more nutrition, or very little. When you have the nutrients that are required for the body does fine, does very well. So I can show, in fact, the thing I've tried to tell the industry, and they won't listen for 40 years now, they should pick chromium, because if you use 100 micrograms 3 times a day of innate response or mega food chromium, and you do it before and after, everybody gets their checkups, it's a 3-month checkup, and they get their blood panels and everything. Well, if you check that at the beginning and end, you're going to have medically measurable improvement in glucose levels, in fatty acid levels, in cholesterol levels. I tell them that's the fastest way you can prove nutrition works in a medically demonstrable way. And nobody will do it. I don't have the money to do it, or I'd do it. Okay? So I have isolated examples. I have a lifetime of work that shows this to be true. So keep your minds open to the way things are intended, were intended to be, and how we've changed and getting back to there. To bring back balance to the force, if I can use the new Star Wars movie reference there for colloquial purposes. So thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for your time, and students for your time to
Thank you.
share some things you otherwise are not likely to hear much or any of. Thank you.
And I had some that we went to lunch with, but if anybody have any questions for them, what I would do is I would look at those substances and look at what is contained. Instead of saying some chemical form, it talks about the plant in which it's grown in. whole,
There's a difference and your body knows the difference. It's that simple. The three most removed items from the foods most Americans most commonly consume, according to the US government almost 10 years ago, are chromium, selenium, and silicon. They're the three least known, they're the three last identified nutrients. They're the three least known, and they do more for basic body processes than any other 10 nutrients do. They're more removed, they're little known, and if you don't get them in the right form, they work less, well in the case of chromium. Selenium in other forms will work somewhat, not nearly as well as in a whole food form. Chromium virtually doesn't work at all if it isn't in a food form. Silicon the same way. This relates to structure, collagen, bone density, blood sugar issues, heart health, Alzheimer's disease. And I could discuss the specifics of each one of them, how they enter in. And amazingly, they tend to work in the brain. Silicon and selenium are first and second, chromium is of third importance. They all work in relation to brain function. In blood sugar, chromium. Diabetes, chromium is first, and then selenium and silicon. In the heart, chromium feeds the heart. Selenium protects the heart. Silicon is for the structural integrity and electrical conductivity of the EEG, the electroencephalogram. Okay, so they all work often in the same areas together, unlike any other items. So I try to get people to do these three, and then we can build, because if I can get them doing these three every day in a particular amount, modest amount, after a month, they're going to keep it up. I don't have to say, hey, you want to keep doing that? They're going back to the store, they're coming back to me and say, can I get some more of that? That makes a difference because it's foundational. It's at the